The Cold War also had a significant impact on domestic politics, with anti-communism becoming a bipartisan consensus, and with the charge or allegation of someone being a communist or a pinko or a simp, short for a communist sympathizer, being used to silence, to ostracize, and in some cases to incarcerate. That movement, of course, we know, because Americans, as we've already talked about, love to personify their movements as the age of McCarthyism. Senator Joseph McCarthy of Wisconsin, waving various documents around. He had a list of 53, sometimes it was 103, sometimes it was some other number, card-carrying communists in the U.S. Department of State. The story of civil rights, and again, the McCarthyism, anti-communism, the Red Scare, this was a thoroughly bipartisan endeavor. The first loyalty security programs were instituted under Truman. The Cold War continued under Eisenhower. Surely the most ardent Cold Warrior was John F. Kennedy, a Democrat. Some of the words that thrill us now when we think of Kennedy are words that, seen in context, should make us think a little more soberly. Let every nation know, whether it wishes us good or ill, that we will pay any price, bear any burden to promote the cause of liberty in the world. Well, one of the places that burden was paid was in places like Vietnam, and it wasn't John Kennedy who paid it. The story of black politics and of the civil rights movement unfolded within that Cold War consensus. And the culture of the Cold War had contradictory implications. On the one hand, the story or the tendency to identify all forms of dissent as communist greatly restricted the room for maneuver of black people fighting for civil rights. Because to do so was inevitably to invite charges that you were a communist. Nowhere did you hear that refrain repeated more frequently than in Mississippi, whose authorities, right from Governor Ross Barnett and Senator James Eastland, down to the lowest, most ordinary man on the street, at least those who were opposed to civil rights, constantly repeated, and I think sincerely believed, at least in most cases, that the civil rights agitation was the product of outside meddlers who were themselves communists or who were dupes of the communists. And that sense of civil rights as an alien form of agitation would license extraordinary, violent repression. At the same time, however, there are curious ways in which the Cold War opened space for black politics, at least certain kinds of black politics. And you can really see this in the history of the NAACP. This isn't that complicated a point, right? If you are the United States and you imagine yourself as in an ideological struggle with the Soviet Union for winning the hearts and minds of people in Africa and Asia, darker people, it's pretty embarrassing when you're saying to the people in Angola or the Congo or Vietnam oh no, our way of life is the one you want, we bring you freedom, when they can read in their newspapers and see on their televisions images of black people being attacked by police dogs or fire hoses. Put differently, the discrimination against black people was bad politics globally for the United States. The U.S. had a global public relations problem, and you better believe that the Soviets fanned it and exploited it. Every time something horrific happened racially, the murder of Emmett Till near Money, Mississippi in 1955, the photos of Emmett Till's battered body, those photos were beamed by TASS, the Soviet news agency, all around the world. That, in other words, opened up space and leverage for black political activists. And you can see this in the history of the NAACP. We've talked a little bit about the NAACP, a venerable organization founded in 1910, an arrival to the accommodationist politics of Booker T. Washington. And here you see a photograph of a young W.E.B. Du Bois, one of the founders of the NAACP, versus Washington, the so-called Wizard of Tuskegee. The NAACP throughout its life pressed for black people to have full civil rights in the United States. It also was the spearhead of the movement to end lynching. Every time an American was lynched, and most of those lynchings by the 20th century were taking place in southern states, not all but most. None, in no state, if I'm not mistaken, were there more than in Mississippi. Every time there was such a lynching outside of NAACP headquarters in New York, this flag flew the next day. A man was lynched yesterday. On several occasions, the NAACP would succeed in getting a federal anti-lynching bill through the U.S. House of Representatives and onto the floor of the Senate. This was the single biggest issue for the NAACP in the 1920s and 30s. And the idea was very simple. If you look at the history of lynching in the United States, and we're talking about at least 40,000 people, something between 80 and 90% of whom were black, you can literally count on your hands, probably count on one hand, the number of people who were convicted. Even though in many of those cases, these lynchings were carnivalesque affairs with thousands of people participating. Taking photographs, routinely, this is something to ponder, taking pieces of flesh, of hair, of knuckles, of rope, as souvenirs, and yet never convicted because no jury of peers, which in southern states, since jurors were drawn from the voters' pool, the voting rolls, and in most southern states, blacks had only very limited access to the voting rolls. None was ever convicted. The NAACP strategy was to get a federal bill so that certain crimes could be prosecuted in federal court. And that bill never passed. This country's never passed a federal anti-lynching. Each time it came onto the floor of the Senate, it was filibustered by Southern senators. In any event, to get back to the main point of the Cold War, the NAACP, you can really see how it struggled in this new post-war reality. On the one hand, the NAACP got viciously red-baited. Here, this is the thing, I'm going to talk more about this in a moment, but here you can see, this was your thing you just wrote about, the identification of civil rights as communist. The NAACP was a cover story on Life magazine in 1946-47, alleged that the NAACP was riddled with Reds. Dr. Du Bois, the organization founder, was actually prosecuted on trumped-up charges for refusing to register as a Soviet agent. He would live out the last years of his life in exile in the independent country of Ghana in West Africa. And yet the NAACP, by expelling the radicals, by endorsing the Cold War consensus, by suggesting that, no, we are not asking for any major overhaul of American institutions. All we want is the right of ordinary black people to share in the same rights that other Americans share in this, the greatest, freest nation in the world. There was a lot of space for that kind of politics because the Truman administration, later the Eisenhower administration, liked that. Because every time a black person stood up and defended the United States, a black political leader, you can be sure that that was beamed out to the world. One thing you can then see in 47, 48 is the Democratic Party under Truman, in the context of the Cold War, and probably also, I should say, reflecting the fact that there are now a lot of black people living in the North and a lot of them can vote, beginning to evince more support for civil rights than the Democratic Party had ever done, and that the Republican Party had done since the collapse of Reconstruction. This is a photograph from 1947. This is Harry Truman after speaking to the annual convention of the NAACP. Now this doesn't seem like much. Since 1947, in fact, every president, with the exception of George W. Bush 1 year, has spoken at, and he took a spanking for not appearing, has spoken at the NAACP's annual convention. But at this time, this was an extraordinarily radical, and one certain to antagonize Southern whites, who, keep in mind, were 100% Democratic voters at this time. The Republicans were the party of Reconstruction, the party of Lincoln. White Southerners, contrary, it's been crazy to your students now. The Solid South was the solidly Democratic South. You know, even FDR, who was better on civil rights than any president previously had been, was assiduous about never allowing himself to be photographed with black people. He would have Eleanor, like when Mary McLeod Bethune would come to the White House, Eleanor could have a picture. Eleanor caused a big scandal once when Mrs. Bethune was speaking, and she started to cough, and Eleanor Roosevelt got up and got her a glass of water. It became an enormous scandal that the president would do this for life. Eleanor could do it. FDR wouldn't. And so here, when you see Truman doing this, you can, please.
Was there a reasoning behind that really was, is there a stereotype image or something that just prompted him to, just because the nation as a whole was that?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I mean, part of, and I'll show you some electoral maps in a moment, right? But part of what's going on here is the Democratic Party is going through changes, right? The Republican Party, you'll remember from year 2, was the party of Lincoln. It was the party that became the party of emancipation. And it was then the party of Reconstruction. Black voted Republican as close to 100%. They voted Republican in a higher proportion than African American voters vote Democratic now. As Frederick Douglass famously said in the 1890s, the Republican Party is the ship and all else is the sea. That finally begins to change a little bit in the 1930s during the New Deal. And what you end up with, and this is getting ahead of the story, and when we're going to have a later session that's going to talk explicitly about this, is the Democratic coalition that FDR puts together is fundamentally incoherent. Because it includes a lot of people who we think of as Democrats today. Northern liberals, unionized workers, Jews, white ethnics, a lot of Catholics, a lot of pointy-headed academics like myself, right? And a solid Democratic white South. So when presidential elections came, just like we now think of the red states, right? We haven't had the election yet in Mississippi in November, but I'll bet anybody in this room that Mississippi will vote Republican in November. Anyone want to take that bet? Well, that certainty was far greater than it would have voted Democratic. So what you have is the emergence of this liberal New Deal coalition that's beginning to take steps of asserting greater federal authority, expanding the social safety net through things like Social Security, guaranteeing unions the right to organize, and at the same time this deeply conservative Southern wing. And so the problem for Democrats was how to hold that coalition together. And part of what FDR was afraid of, the Southerners were also very cagey. Actually, Southerners still do this. Southerners routinely returned the same white senators to the Senate every 6 years. What that meant was that they accumulated seniority. It meant they controlled the committees without which no legislation could pass. So if FDR wanted to pass any legislation, if it offended conservative white Southerners, he couldn't. This is significant. Most Americans don't know this. The Social Security Act, the single most important piece of social legislation this country has ever passed. The Social Security Act originally excluded 3 categories of workers. Teachers, you all are one, right? Domestic workers and agricultural workers. The 2 largest categories of black employment in the country that encompassed a substantial majority of black people were excluded from the Social Security system. I get a little crazy, and now I will say something editorially, about the racialization of the discourse around welfare, as if this is a handout to black people. Historically, social welfare policies have enriched white people at the expense of black people. That may or may not be the case today, but it is certainly the case historically. So, that's the problem. And what you begin to see is Truman, partly because he's very concerned about the Cold War and about America's reputation abroad, partly because he's beginning to discover that he can't get legislation through these Southern senators anyway,